The snowstorm outside had reached its peak. The wind howled, carrying the cold in sharp, biting gusts, while thick snowflakes covered everything in sight. The world outside was a blur of white, the trees barely visible through the dense snowfall. Inside the house, the warmth was a stark contrast to the icy conditions outside. The man stood by the window, watching the storm, his hand resting on the cold glass. He had been inside for hours, safe and comfortable. The storm nothing more than a distant noise to him. But then something caught his eye. Outside, standing at the door, was a German shepherd. Her fur was thick with snow, her body hunched low to the ground, her eyes wide with desperation. She was shivering violently, but she didn't move from her spot, her gaze fixed on the door, as if waiting for something, or someone. The man's heart skipped a beat as he watched her. There was something about the way she stood there, unwavering, as if she was pleading for help. Behind her, 2 tiny puppies were huddled in the snow, their little bodies barely visible, wrapped in the same snow that covered their mother. The shepherd's breath formed visible clouds in the freezing air, her body trembling with the cold, but she made no attempt to leave, as if the need to protect her pups kept her rooted to the spot. The man hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do. The decision to open the door wasn't one he could make lightly. He had always been a man of logic, preferring to avoid anything that might disrupt his peace. But this was different. The dog's desperate eyes, the way she kept her puppies close, even in such brutal cold, it struck something deep inside him. He wasn't sure if he could handle the responsibility, but he knew that leaving them out there wasn't an option. The shepherd whined softly, her head turning towards the man, as if she knew he was watching. Her gaze never left him, and for a brief moment he felt a connection. The puppies, too small to understand, were still, barely moving, their tiny bodies shivering in the cold. The storm had been raging for hours, and they had no way of surviving out there much longer. He could feel his heart racing. What was he supposed to do? The dog was asking for help, and yet he wasn't sure if he was ready to let them in. The man stepped back from the window, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The decision seemed simple. Open the door and bring them inside. But it wasn't. He wasn't sure if he was capable of handling this. Could he really take in a dog and her puppies? Could he handle the responsibility? The warmth inside the house seemed to mock him as he stood there, paralyzed by indecision. But the sound of the dog's soft whine, barely audible over the wind, pulled him back to reality. The storm raged on outside, and the dog remained rooted to the spot, her gaze still locked on him. The man's breath fogged up the window as he stared at the shepherd, her eyes pleading for something, anything, that would bring them warmth and safety. Could he do it? Could he open the door and change everything for both the animals and himself? He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but in that moment, as the dog's eyes met his, he knew what needed to be done. The man slowly turned back toward the door, his heart pounding. His hand reached for the handle, but he hesitated, his mind racing with doubts. The storm howled louder, the wind rattling the windows as if urging him to make a decision. The dog outside, despite her frozen body and shivering form, remained steadfast, her eyes never leaving the door. She knew help was just a few steps away, and yet she didn't move. Her loyalty to her pups, even in such brutal cold, kept her grounded. The puppies, too weak to move on their own, remained still beneath their mother, their tiny bodies barely visible against the thick snow that clung to them. The man's fingers tightened around the doorknob, but his thoughts kept pulling him back. What if he opened the door and let them inside, only to regret it later? What if taking them in was more than he could handle? These thoughts flooded his mind, but as he looked at the shepherd, something in him shifted. He had always been someone who preferred control, who avoided things that could complicate his life. But this moment, this decision, it was different. His eyes returned to the shepherd's gaze. There was something deeply moving in the way she stood, unwavering in the face of a storm, her body shivering, but her determination unbroken. It was as if she had given everything for her pups, offering herself up to the cold to protect them. And now she was asking for help. The soft whine that escaped her mouth seemed to echo in his chest, breaking down the walls he had so carefully built around his heart. The puppies had started to move now, weak and fragile, but still clinging to life. The sight of them, so small and vulnerable in the storm, stirred something deep within him. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He couldn't turn away when they needed him most. He had been so closed off, so afraid to let others in, but in this moment it felt like opening the door to them was the only thing that mattered. Without thinking, the man turned the handle and pulled the door open. The cold air rushed in, but so did the urgency, the gravity of the moment. The shepherd didn't move immediately, still uncertain, as if she wasn't sure if she could trust him. Her eyes scanned his face, reading him in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. After a few moments, she took a hesitant step forward, her legs shaking under her, her body trembling from the cold. But she didn't stop. She walked slowly, carefully, her eyes never leaving him, guiding her pups forward with soft nudges. As the shepherd stepped inside, the man quickly moved to help the smaller of the two puppies. He scooped it up gently, cradling it in his arms. The tiny creature barely stirred, its frail body limp from the cold. The other puppy followed, its eyes barely open, but it was still moving. The shepherd, too, stepped inside, pausing for a brief moment before settling down beside them, her protective instincts kicking in. She stayed close, nudging her pups to her side, keeping them warm with her body. The man closed the door behind them, sealing out the storm. The warmth of the house hit him like a wave, but it wasn't just the temperature that felt different. There was a shift in the air, an unspoken understanding between him and the dog. He had made the decision to open the door, but it felt like the door had been opened to something much bigger, something deeper within himself. The shepherd, her pups, and even the storm outside had managed to crack open a part of him he hadn't realized was closed. As he knelt down, placing the puppy gently by the fireplace to warm up, the shepherd moved closer to him, her eyes locked onto his with a silent gratitude. She didn't need to speak. Her trust, her quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened, was enough. The man sat back, watching the dog settle down, the warmth beginning to fill the room. The storm still raged outside, but inside there was peace. The world had shifted in those few moments, and for the first time in a long while, the man felt something he hadn't in years: hope. He didn't know what was next, but in that moment, he understood that opening the door had been the first step to something he could never have anticipated. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the room filled with warmth, and the man sat quietly, watching the shepherd and her pups. The little ones, now no longer stiff from the cold, were beginning to stir, their tiny bodies slowly warming in the safe comfort of the house. The shepherd lay close to them, her head resting on her paws, keeping a vigilant eye on her pups as they relaxed for the first time in hours. Her own body was still shivering, but there was a look of relief in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that she could finally let go of her guard. The man couldn't take his eyes off them. What had started as a simple decision to open the door had turned into something far more profound. He hadn't expected to feel this way, connected, responsible, even vulnerable. As he watched the shepherd nuzzle her pups, he realized how much they had already begun to change him. They had made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He had spent so long avoiding connections, too afraid to risk feeling anything. But now, as he sat there, watching this small family, it was clear that his life had shifted in ways he didn't understand yet. The puppies, now awake and slowly moving around, were still fragile, but their tiny bodies no longer seemed as fragile as before. They were beginning to show signs of life, growing stronger with each passing minute. The man's heart swelled with something unexpected, an overwhelming sense of pride in what he had done. He had opened the door to save them, but in return, they had given him something precious, a chance to feel needed again. The shepherd glanced up at him, her eyes softening with trust. There was no doubt anymore he had made the right choice. She seemed to know that she and her pups were safe now, that they had found a place where they could rest and recover. The man felt something stir inside him as he met her gaze. It was a wordless understanding. She was no longer just a stray dog he had let inside. She was family now, and she knew it. As the room grew quieter, with only the crackling of the fire breaking the silence, the man found himself thinking about what had led him to this moment. What had he been running from all these years? Why had he closed himself off so completely? And in opening the door, in letting this small family inside, had he found the strength he needed to open his own heart again? His mind drifted, but it wasn't long before his thoughts were interrupted by a soft whine. The shepherd had raised her head, her ears perked up. The man stood up and moved toward her. She looked up at him with pleading eyes, her body tense, her attention fully focused on the door. The man felt a flicker of concern. What was it? Was something wrong? He walked toward the door, his heart racing, unsure of what to expect. He turned the handle slowly, hesitantly. Was it just the storm continuing to rage outside, or was there something more? As he opened the door slightly, the wind rushed in, but there was nothing to see. No other animals, no threats, just the relentless storm. But as he closed the door again, the shepherd relaxed. She gave him a soft nudge, almost as if to say, "Thank you." The moment passed, and the room settled back into the quiet calm of safety. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The dog's protective instincts were still strong, still ready to guard her pups. And in that moment, he realized something else. He was now part of that protection too. He had opened the door to let them in, but they had let him into their lives as well. This was a bond that went beyond simple rescue. It was the beginning of something he hadn't known he needed: companionship, trust, and the quiet strength that comes from being part of something bigger than himself. As he sat back down by the fire, the shepherd and her pups curled up beside him, he finally understood. The storm might be howling outside, but inside, everything had changed. The following days brought an unexpected peace to the house. The storm had passed, but the man's heart had begun to thaw in a way he had never expected. Every morning he woke up to the sound of the puppy's soft whimpers and the shepherd's quiet, watchful gaze. They were no longer the frail creatures he had rescued from the cold. They had begun to grow stronger, their little bodies filling out as they fed and rested. The shepherd, too, seemed to recover from the shock of the storm, her body slowly warming up as she rested next to her pups, her eyes never straying far from them. The man found himself watching them more and more. He had opened the door to save them, yes, but in doing so, he had unknowingly opened his own heart to something that had been missing for years. The puppies, with their playful energy and innocent joy, had brought a new rhythm to the house. They would wag their little tails excitedly, chasing after each other in circles, their tiny paws slipping on the smooth wooden floors. The shepherd would watch them, her eyes filled with contentment, as if knowing that her pups were finally safe. But there was something more to the way the dog had bonded with him. It wasn't just the protective instinct she had toward her pups. It was the way she had come to trust him. She had given him a silent acknowledgement, a look that spoke volumes, as if she knew he would protect them just as fiercely as she did. And every time she looked at him, he felt the weight of that trust, something he had never experienced before. It was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was a deep connection that went beyond words. The mornings were now filled with the sound of the shepherd's soft steps and the puppy's excited yelps. The man found himself spending more time with them, talking to them softly as he went about his day. There was no longer any hesitation when he opened the door, no fear of what taking them in might mean. He had learned to let go of the walls he had built around himself, and with each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. But the biggest change came when the man realized that he no longer felt alone. The warmth of the house, the presence of the dogs, and the quiet companionship they offered filled a void in his life that he hadn't known existed. The puppies would curl up beside him while he worked, and the shepherd would lie at his feet, content to be near him. It was as if they had become a part of his routine, a part of his life. He could no longer imagine his days without them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the room, the shepherd looked up at the man once more. This time, there was no urgency in her eyes, no fear or desperation. She was simply looking at him, as if to say, "Thank you." The man smiled softly, reaching down to pet her, his hand resting gently on her fur. He didn't need to say anything. The moment was enough. It was in the way she trusted him now, in the way her pups had thrived under his care, in the way their lives had intertwined with his. The fire crackled in the background, and the room filled with a peaceful silence. Outside, the storm was long gone, but the warmth inside the house was still strong, a testament to the bond that had formed between them. The man had opened the door that night, but in doing so, he had opened himself up to something he had never expected: connection, trust, and love. As the puppies curled up by the fire, their tiny bodies finally at peace, the shepherd lay down beside them, her watchful eyes closed in contentment, and the man, with his heart full, sat back, knowing that his life had been forever changed. The storm outside had long passed, but inside he had found something far more valuable: a family, a home, and a place where he truly belonged.